Welcome to this webcast. I'm Lee White and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director at the IFRS Foundation. As many of you are aware, the trustees of the IFRS Foundation have over the past year, 18 months, been considering the creation of a new standard setting board, the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, within the foundations of the governance structure. Today, I and colleagues on the Technical Readiness Working Group would like to take you through an agenda to explain more of what has been occurring. Our agenda will cover background, it will introduce more carefully the TRWG, give you a sentiment of our speakers today, and more importantly, go into more detail regarding the TRWG's work and the timeline. Let me set some context. The process started with a public consultation in September 2020 by the IFRS Foundation's trustees. The feedback that we received to that consultation showed there is strong demand for a global solution for companies' sustainability-related disclosure to meet investors' needs. And there was also broad support for the IFRS Foundation to play a role in developing these types of standards. Now, informed by the feedback to the consultation and support from organisations such as IOSCO, the International Securities Regulators, the trustees decided to undertake further work on the creation of a new board, which we propose as a possible response to that consultation. Let's set out now the strategic direction from the trustees. So in March of this year, the trustees set out the main considerations for the potential new board. In short, these were for it to focus on meeting investors' information needs, enterprise value, focused disclosure that influence investment decisions, building on the outstanding existing work that already was evident, create a global baseline of standards that enable investors to have common information around the world that jurisdictions can adopt and combine with their jurisdictional specific requirements, and to start with climate, but to go beyond that to cover other environmental, social and governance matters. To operationalise this, the trustees set up some working groups. One of these working groups was the Technical Readiness Working Group. This webcast will provide an update on the work that this group has undertaken since the trustees announced its formation in March of this year. Let's go to the TRWG remit. The purpose of the TRWG is to provide recommendations for consideration by the new board to help really give it a running start. This is important as there's an urgent demand for global sustainability-related standards to meet investors' needs. The TRWG's work is threefold, and as well as providing technical recommendations for consideration by the new board, it will provide input on consolidating the current landscape that comprises many initiatives, and it will provide strategic input to support standard setting, prioritisation and planning. What is important to highlight is that the work by the TRWG is not a substitute for following the due process the Foundation is recognised for in its standard setting work. I really want to emphasise this point. The work being done is being used to provide the best possible recommendations for the new board to consider. Any proposals for new standards by the board will be consulted on publicly and matters discussed in public meetings to enable all those with interest and views and ability to share With that introduction, let me tell you who is on the TRWG. The members are organisations that have already done a huge amount of work and very high quality work to help meet investors' information needs. They are, and I do this in alphabetical order, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, the IFRS Foundation's International Accounting Standards Board, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, created by the Financial Stability Board, the Value Reporting Foundation, which consists of the former Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and the International Integrated Reporting Council, and the World Economic Forum. In addition, we have IOSCO and the International Public Accounting Standards Board as observers. This group has been incredibly active over the past 6 months. They've dedicated a huge amount of time and really worked constructively and tremendously hard to enable the new board to have a solid base on which to start its work. The members bring vast experience and insight. Now, bringing this group together is consistent with two important messages the trustees received to their consultation: that the trustees' work should provide a basis for consolidating a very busy standard-setting environment, and secondly, that the proposed new board should build upon the good work that's been done already rather than starting with a clean sheet of paper. In effect, we don't have time to do that approach. We need to build on the high-quality work done already. Now, a common perception is perhaps there is a lot of overlap between the content of these organisations, but the reality is they complement each other particularly well. For example, the TCFD's recommendations and CDSB framework include higher level disclosure recommendations, which go well with the VRF's detailed and industry-specific standards. Leveraging the content of a complementary way enables the creation of a basis of recommendations for future standards. Now, before we move to describing the TRWG's deliverables, let me introduce the speakers. We have Janine, the Chief Executive Officer of the Value Reporting Foundation, Mardi, the Managing Director of the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, Curtis, the Secretariat Member of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, Sue, the Vice Chair of the International Accounting Standards Board, and Olivier, the Managing Director of the World Economic Forum. And again, I'd just like to express on behalf of the trustees and the foundation our great appreciation for all of the work that these organisations and these individuals have been undertaking. So let me now give an overview of the deliverables. The TRWG's technical work has consisted of 8 different work streams as outlined on this slide. They range from further enhancing the climate standard prototype that was developed, building on the TCFD's recommendations by the TRWG member organisations last year, to discussing how the proposed new board can ensure there's an appropriate synergy and connectivity between its work and the work of the IASB. If the ISSB, under the governance of the IFRS Foundation, is launched in November, the recommendations from the TRWG will be provided to the ISSB for consideration. The ISSB will then decide on next steps. The work of that board, if it's established, will be subject to its independent due process. This will include any recommendations to the TRWG that the board wishes to use. Our speakers will be taking us through a brief explanation of each of the TRWG's technical deliverables. We'll be publishing another webcast in due course that will go into further detail regarding the strategic implications of each of the TRWG's deliverables. First up is Curtis from TCFD, who will talk about the Enhanced Prototype Climate Standard.
Thank you, Lee. The objective of this deliverable is to further develop the prototype climate-related disclosure standard published last year to provide a basis for consideration as an exposure draft for the ISSB. The prototype climate standard, rooted in the TCFD recommendations, would require an entity to disclose information that enables users of general purpose financial reporting to assess 4 primary areas: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. Under governance, this is governance processes, controls, and procedures a reporting entity uses to monitor and manage climate-related risks and opportunities. Under strategy, there are 5 categories. Number 1 is the climate-related risks and opportunities that could enhance, threaten, or change the entity's business model and strategy over the short, medium, and long term. Number 2 is the actual and potential impact of climate-related risks and opportunities on the entity's business model. 3 is whether and how climate-related risks and opportunities serve as an input to and influence management strategy and decision-making. 4, the impact of climate-related risks and opportunities on an entity's financial position and performance, both currently and over the short, medium, and long term, and whether and how these are reflected in the financial statements. And 5th, the resilience of an entity's enterprise value to climate-related risks. On risk management, it's about how climate-related risks are identified, assessed, and managed. And lastly, on metrics and targets, this is the entity's performance against industry-specific and cross-industry metrics and targets used to manage and monitor climate-related risks and opportunities over time. Now, let me hand over to Mardi, who will talk about the presentation standard and the digitization strategy.
Thanks, Curtis. The objective of this deliverable is to further develop the prototype presentation standard published last year alongside the prototype climate standard to provide a basis for consideration as an exposure draft for the ISSB. Inspired by IAS 1, Presentation of Financial Statements, the CDSB framework, and the IR framework, the presentation standard will set out the overall requirements for sustainability-related financial disclosures, including how they should be structured and the requirements for their content, guiding preparers on how to disclose. Importantly, this standard proposes that preparers are required to provide all material sustainability-related financial information, so describing how to arrange the information is so important. The presentation standard also sets out important core concepts to assist preparers in preparing sustainability-related financial information. This includes the application of conceptual elements such as materiality in the context of sustainability-related financial disclosures, describes where the information should be presented, and the qualitative characteristics of useful sustainability-related financial information. So now thinking about the digitization strategy. The objective of this deliverable is to provide recommendations for consideration for the ISSB's digital financial reporting strategy and take stock of the Technical Readiness Working Group's existing digital experience and enabling technology. We felt it was critical that the digitization was considered from the outset of ISSB's work. So this deliverable has 2 main components. So the first is the digital financial reporting strategy, which will provide us with 2 important things. The first is a high-level set of recommendations for potential ISSB digital financial reporting strategy, which interfaces directly with the IASB's work. And the second is a detailed set of recommendations for a potential ISSB digital taxonomy. So, for example, reflecting how best to build upon a taxonomy, having reviewed the climate prototype standard as a basis for that analysis. So the second main deliverable focuses on the digital experience and will provide the recommendations for consideration for a potential ISSB strategy on stakeholder digital experience and the enabling technologies that will support that strategy. This component primarily involves taking stock of the Technical Readiness Working Group's digital offerings in terms of their delivery of standards with the outside world, such as SASB Standards Navigator and the Knowledge Hub on the TCFD operated by CDSB, and the technology that supports the drafting and production processes of standard setting. Now let me hand over to Janine, who will talk about the architecture of standards and consideration for due process.
Thanks, Mardi. As described by Mardi, the proposed presentation standard will require preparers to provide material sustainability-related financial information beyond just climate. Consistent with the structure set out in that standard, the TRWG recommends that the architecture of standards that would ultimately be issued by the ISSB would be structured around 4 pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. In addition, the TRWG is recommending that the standards issued by the ISSB would be arranged by both theme and by industry. Thematic standards are for topics that have pervasive impacts on enterprise value across entities, regardless of their industry. Climate is the most obvious example of that. These standards would result in comparable market-wide disclosures from all entities on a given theme that is relevant to investors and other participants in the world's capital markets. Industry standards are equally important as thematic standards. They provide industry-specific disclosure topics and metrics on the topics that are most relevant to financial performance for the typical company in an industry. Industry standards facilitate comparability across entities within a given industry. And industry-specific information has been flagged as critical by both IOSCO and by investors in their responses to the trustees' 2020 consultation paper. I'm going to take a minute to talk about due process and the due process deliverables from the TRWG. The objective of the due process deliverable is to provide recommendations for consideration for characteristics of an ISSB's due process, both during a transition phase in the early phases of the ISSB and for an ultimate steady state. The TRWG is considering several elements for an ISSB's due process, including building upon the existing IFRS Foundation due process principles of transparency, full and fair consultation, and accountability. Considering the due process of the existing organizations in their standard setting work, and the potential need for an adaptable due process in the ISSB's initial work that can develop as its standard setting processes mature. Enabling adaptability and also ensuring that the balance of timeliness and quality is considered. And this is a key point, because as we all know, sustainability issues are maturing very, very rapidly. And so the key question is how to design a due process that can meet that balance of timeliness and quality. This due process work includes a mapping exercise comparing the due process of the members of the TRWG that will inform the IFRS Foundation Trustees Due Process Oversight Committee. The good news is that many of the TRWG's members modeled their existing due processes on the IASBs, which will be an important point to understand and consider. I'm now going to hand over to Sue, who will talk about conceptual guidelines for standard setting and the connectivity between the IASB and its potential new sister board. So Sue, over to you.
Thanks, Janine. Ultimately, it will be important for the ISSB to have a conceptual framework to inform and underpin its decision-making. But at this stage, the Technical Readiness Working Group has prioritised working on concepts and adaptations from the IASB's conceptual framework that are relevant from the perspective of preparers to support the initial application of the ISSB's requirements. These can then be further developed at a later stage into a full conceptual framework. The TRWG recommends that the ISSB would have a conceptual framework that would play a similar role to that of the IASB's conceptual framework for financial reporting. So the purpose of the conceptual framework would be to assist the ISSB when it develops its standards using consistent concepts, to assist preparers to develop consistent reporting practices where no ISSB standard applies, and to help all parties understand and interpret the ISSB standards. The TRWG also recommends that, like those in the IASB's conceptual framework, the conceptual principles used by the ISSB would not be part of or have the status of an IFRS standard, so the concepts would not override an IFRS sustainability standard or any requirements in one of those standards. And the concepts could be repeated or elaborated on in the ISSB standards, as is the case today for IFRS accounting standards, thus leading to specific requirements. For example, the concept of materiality in the IASB's conceptual framework is incorporated in IAS 1, Presentation of Financial Statements, where that standard provides more detail and application guidance. The TRWG has noted that the IASB and the ISSB are united by a common primary user and objective, making many aspects of the IASB's conceptual framework potentially applicable to the ISSB. But the TRWG has identified adaptations to the IASB's conceptual framework in order to develop and maintain standards that address the market need for consistent, comparable and reliable sustainability-related financial disclosures. Stakeholders have repeatedly raised the importance of making sure that the standards set by a new board work well with the standards set by the IASB to create a package of information that is useful to investors. We refer to this as having good connectivity. The details are still to be worked out, but this slide illustrates some aspects of connectivity between the boards that the TRWG has been discussing. For example, both boards will focus on meeting investor information needs, so it's important that the standards they create are compatible and complementary. The TRWG's recommendations for consideration in this area include the following: governance and constitutional arrangements, operational matters, such as how the technical staff working with the two boards would be organised, what the scope of the IASB's work should be relative to that of the ISSB, how the two boards should work together when a project is of interest to both boards. So, for example, if information about intangibles should be included in part in the financial statements and in part in sustainability-related financial disclosure, how the two boards should work together to meet investor information needs, and how the reporting required by the IASB and the ISSB should be connected. This could include, for example, considering the next steps on the redeliberations of the IASB's management commentary project. Let me now hand over to Olivier to talk about other items to inform a standards agenda.
Thank you, Sue. It's great to be with you all today, and let me reiterate the wholehearted support of the World Economic Forum for this initiative and our appreciation for the significant progress that this working group has achieved so far. The role of the forum in this process, alongside our colleagues from sustainability and integrated reporting organizations, is to reflect the perspective of our stakeholders. For the forum, that is to represent a community of preparers and contribute our work on cross-industry metrics and disclosures that CEOs of a wide range of the world's largest multinational companies have found to be important for disclosure. Let me turn to the content of this deliverable now. The objective is to provide recommendations for consideration on the items that demonstrate the features of pressing topics for potential standard setting by the ISSB. This deliverable has two main components. The first is providing recommendations for considerations on the most pressing items for potential standard setting. This is delivered based on the expertise and experience of the Technical Readiness Working Group members. The items can include both sustainability matters, for instance, water, biodiversity, workforce management, community relations, land use, as well as industries for which standard setting could be most important, such as oil and gas, agriculture, and coal. The second component of this deliverable is focused on providing recommendations for consideration regarding the broader work plan to advance the establishment of the ISSB through its transition phase towards the envisioned end state. This could include topics such as developing conceptual framework and next steps on management commentary. This list can then inform a new ISSB and feed into an envisioned agenda consultation that the new board would launch expeditiously. Let me now hand over to Lee to conclude.
Thank you very much, Olivier. Now, before I wrap up, let me say a couple of words about the next steps. The IFRS Foundation Trustees are currently discussing the feedback received to their second consultation published in April this year. This set out proposed changes to the Foundation's constitution to facilitate the formation of a new board and sets out the governance arrangements, the form and function of the proposed board. At the same time, they're continuing their work to satisfy the criteria identified in their first consultation paper as key to the successful creation of a new sustainability standards board. They are on track to make a final determination by COP26 in Glasgow in early November. During this period, the TRWG will continue its work and prepare to hand over its recommendations for consideration by the new board once up and running. Now, if you want to follow more about the trustees' work, you can register to receive alerts on the IFRS Foundation's website. Thank you very much for your time.